Okay, thanks for having me. So I've got the after lunch slot, and now I'm going to hit you with some research, so bear with me here. So this is good. I'm sure everybody's paying hard attention. I'm going to spend some time talking about a study that we conducted looking at underplanted shortleaf pine seedling survival and growth in the North Carolina Piedmont. So we've heard a lot today about stuff from the Western Range, and I'm going to bring it back over to our side of the Mississippi River. So like other states, North Carolina, for the past several decades, has been experiencing a decline in the forest cover types, or shortleaf pine forest cover types. And this includes both the shortleaf pine type as well as the shortleaf pine oak mixtures. And this FIA data makes it pretty clear that we've been experiencing pretty rapid declines for the past several decades. And what's a little bit more alarming is when we look a little deeper into the FIA data, we find that the balance of overstory trees, or the ratio of overstory trees to understory trees, is out of balance. We have a lot of older trees, not a lot of younger trees. And what that shows us is that we're not regenerating shortleaf pine. The types of management that we're applying to our landscape is not really creating the conditions for this stuff to regenerate naturally. So if we're to kind of reverse this trend, or at least slow this trend a little bit, what we need to do is start focusing some of our management on regeneration to help balance this all out. And this is going to have to include both artificial regeneration and natural regeneration. The good news, we saw a couple maps earlier. This is a map of the central Appalachian Piedmont region. And I've laid a couple of different things over this. The pink area is the native range of shortleaf pine. This green area that you can kind of see here on the coast, that's the native range of loblolly pine. And the brown area, or it looks brown to me, that's where they overlap. Good news when we're talking about regenerating shortleaf pine in the central Appalachian Piedmont in North Carolina and Virginia is that it's all within the range. It grows pretty well there. If you come take a look at our forest stands, you'll see shortleaf pine actually does pretty well on the sites where it's growing. And there's a huge chunk of the Piedmont that would meet the characteristics of kind of our restoration objectives, or the priority areas that we talked about earlier this morning. Doesn't overlap with the native range of loblolly pine, and has some of the other site conditions that would make it an attractive, we wouldn't be competing with loblolly pine to the degree where we would if we tried to regenerate shortleaf pine in the eastern part of our state, where we tend to grow loblolly for good reason. We can grow the heck out of it. We grow a lot of loblolly within my division. In fact, the research project I'm showing you right now, we paid for 100% of that with loblolly pine that we harvested in eastern North Carolina. So. The other thing that tends to grow really well in the Piedmont of North Carolina is our population density. So, and I know that you're experiencing this in some of your other states, but I think we're well on the path to really have kind of a population problem. But we're currently the 10th most populated state. We're just a hair under 10 million people. That puts us right behind Georgia and Ohio. That puts it puts it into perspective. And you look at our Piedmont region, that's where all of our people are. And it's also where our interstate system is. So all signs point to the continued development, the continued population expansion in the Piedmont region. And that does a number of things for us. First off, it makes some of the traditional methods that we know, or that we understand are effective in regenerating shortleaf pine. When we talk about natural regeneration, things like prescribed fire, or when it comes to artificially regenerating it, intensive site preparation, including burning and broadcast applications of herbicides and mechanical site prep. Those types of things can be a little bit difficult to apply in a landscape where you have several million people. The other thing that can come, smoke sensitivity, user or public opinion of some of the forest management that we're doing, they can all play a role. The other thing that happens is, as I just mentioned, some of the landowner values and goals and objectives of some of the landowners that are actually moving into these areas are different, and they're not as tolerant as some of the traditional forest management techniques. I can tell you the people that are moving into this area are not moving from over here. They're moving from up here. Okay, they're moving from all over the country. They just did a survey. It was something like 40% of North Carolinians are not actually from North Carolina. So we're having a major shift in the type of people, and it changes some of the preferences. Things like clear-cut harvesting and broadcast applications of herbicides just aren't as accepted as they used to be. Furthermore, some of the people or a lot of the people rather, that we can actually talk into restoring something like shortleaf pine or regenerating shortleaf pine, they're not necessarily interested in those types of practices either. So they oftentimes, if they can be talked into shortleaf, it's for wildlife management objectives, aesthetics and things like that, where a giant clear cut to regenerate an even stand is not within their goals and objectives. So we looked around and tried to find some type of method that might be effective in regenerating shortleaf pine in kind of these changing conditions where public opinion and some of the management constraints that we're dealing with come into play. And we found underplanting. Plain and simple of it, artificially regenerating trees underneath an existing overstory. That could be a hardwood or a mixed stand or a pine overstory. It doesn't really matter. You're artificially regenerating beneath that residual overstory. And some of the research suggests that this can be an effective way to regenerate shortleaf pine in areas where the visual impacts of forest management are a concern, or where overstory retention is either desired or perhaps even required for other reasons. We're certainly not the first people to think about doing this. We actually based this off of a couple of different research projects that have been done. These are the four most recent ones. I understand there's actually one in Tennessee that I don't have on here, but a lot of these studies have been done looking at underplanting shortleaf pine beneath residual hardwood overstories. And they have a couple of things in common. One of the things is that they've all found that there's an inverse relationship between overstory density and underplanted seedling growth. So the more trees you have, or the more higher overstory density, less pine growth. The other thing that they have in common is that they've all been conducted in Missouri and Arkansas. That's about 500 miles away from the central Appalachian Piedmont region. We have some differences in site, we have some differences in climate. We just don't have any local applications of this type of research or really that much shortleaf pine management for our land managers and our private landowners to go take a look at. So we put our heads together and came up with an idea to do a research project looking at some of these methods in North Carolina. We started off by doing an underplanting study. And our objective here is to evaluate the effectiveness of underplanting as a way to reestablish that shortleaf pine component into mixed stands in the central Appalachian Piedmont region. And we went after this in two parts. First, we wanted to evaluate the effectiveness, or we wanted to evaluate the impact of overstory density on underplanted seedling growth on that North Carolina Piedmont site. And then we actually added a little bit of a seedling component to this thing. And this honestly was kind of unplanned. We just ended up with a couple of different stock types to play around with. They became available, so we put them in. But we decided to evaluate the differences in survival and growth in this underplanting system using both containerized and bare root seedlings. So the study site we selected for this study, if any of you have ever worked in the central Appalachian Piedmont, this probably looks pretty familiar to you. It's your standard mixed hardwood pine stand. It's been through at least 3 stages of agricultural abandonment. Doesn't have much topsoil left. It's been high graded a few times. So kind of your run-of-the-mill Appalachian Piedmont abused hardwood stand. Shows evidence of old shortleaf pine. There wasn't much left in the overstory here. We had that nice sea of stumps we heard about earlier this morning, suggesting that it used to be there, but it was removed. Like I said, abandoned ag land, had silt loams and sandy loam soils, receives on the low end of the Piedmont average precipitation, only about 45 inches of rain a year, which is on the low end for the Piedmont. So it's a nice dry site. For whatever reason, this part of the state just doesn't seem to get as much rain. And the elevations were a whopping 440 to 480 feet, which puts it as one of the high points in the county. So we're kind of right here in the fall line area. This is, pretty much a high rocky ridge in the Piedmont area, just outside of Durham, North Carolina. The experimental design we picked to start looking at underplanting, we took this ridge. We had 4 residual basal area treatments. We tried to make these line up with some of the normal operator select style harvesting densities that we might recommend. So we had a clear cut treatment, which would be a basal area of 0, 15, which kind of like a seed tree, and then 30 and 45 square feet of residual basal area, which we would put more in line with different levels of shelterwood harvesting. We applied those to 1/3 of an acre circular treatment plots. And within each one of those plots, we nested a seedling measurement plot. We replicated each one 7 times to try to take into account the difference in slope and aspect and soil type across this site, degrees of rockiness. Some of these sites were rock fields, and some of these sites actually had pretty deep soil. It varied across the site. And like I said, we used 3 different stock types. About those stock types, we had 2 containerized stock and 1 bare root stock. We used 1 containerized stock that used a large plug, a little bit deeper. Then we used another containerized stock that had a smaller plug. Both of these used a North Carolina seed source, but we don't think it was the same North Carolina seed source. Unfortunately, we can't really figure that out. So they're both from North Carolina, but they could be from different orchard mixes. And then we used a bare root seedling that was grown in Virginia using a Virginia Piedmont seed source. Also, these 2 North Carolina seed sources were also Piedmont sourced. When it came to implementation, this was a commercial job. My division's receipt-based, so when we do our harvests, whether they're commercial harvests, we send them out for bid, have traditional logging equipment do it, come in and take care of it. We didn't really have that much trouble doing it. We went in, we marked the leaf trees that we wanted, we sent the logger in, they whole tree harvested it, they pulled all the tops out, left us with a nice and clean site. Unfortunately, the top wood was supposed to be used for woody biomass, but that kind of fell through, so now we have a 1-acre pile of tops out in the woods. But that was completed, and then we followed that up with underplanting by hand these seedlings of 3 different stock types. We came in, we measured the initial seedling ground line diameters as well as heights at the time of planting. We wanted to use those as covariates in the model. And we also came back in and measured seedling survival, ground line diameter, and height after the first and second growing seasons. So the results we found after 1 year. Now, I should mention, we're basing our results when it comes to survival off of first year data. And we're doing our growth off of second year data. The reason we're doing that is we ended up with a lot of insect damage on this site. Red-headed sawfly beat us up. It ate about 30% of the seedlings, or defoliated about 30% of them. Then we had a winter storm the same year, and the deer came in, they were hungry, and ate about another 30% of the seedlings. So between sawfly and deer, and then just natural mortality, we ended up losing or having about 70% of our seedlings affected by something in this study. The good news is I went in pretty early to gather the first year growth and survival data in preparation for a different conference, and we missed a lot of that. We missed the sawfly infestation, we missed the deer damage. So we have pretty good survival data for the first year. What we found is that stock type and residual basal area significantly affected first year survival. But really, it kind of came down to the 0 square foot plots. Once we get outside of the clear-cut areas, survival didn't really change by residual basal area. It's pretty much even across it. But we had poor survival for 2 of the stock types in the clear-cut plots. And this is a little different than some of the other research that's come out that actually showed the opposite, that retaining overstory could actually reduce your seedling survival. So then when we looked at the actual stock types over here, we found that the containerized stock, the large plug one, grew really well. It averaged about 99% survival, or it survived well, 99%. The smaller plug, still a very good 91% survival. Operationally insignificant between those 2. Statistically significant, but operationally about the same. And then when we looked at the bare root stuff, it was only about a 64% survival, but a lot of that was dragged down by this very poor survival in the clear-cut plot. When we looked at ground line diameter growth, again, we found residual basal area and stock type had significant effects on these things. We found that when we looked at residual basal area, we had that similar inverse relationship that the previous studies from the Western Range had found. 15 and 0 square foot plots, trees put on more ground line diameter growth. They did not put on as much ground line diameter growth under higher residual basal areas. What's interesting is that they were kind of coupled. So if you look, the 0 square foot plots and the 15 square foot plots, they weren't significantly different from each other. They're actually pretty similar. And then the 30 and 45, same thing. So they were binned, but they still showed that inverse relationship. And when we looked at the stock types, we found that the large plug containerized stock definitely had great growth, and it was significantly better in some measures than the small plug containerized stuff. But those 2 tended to grow similarly. But the containerized stuff on average did quite a bit better, put on quite a bit more growth than the bare root stock. And we found about the same thing when it came to height growth. Again, the 0 and 15 square foot plots outperformed the 30 and 45 square foot plots, indicating that inverse relationship. And again, we found that the large plug containerized stock put on quite a bit more growth than the bare root stock. But in this particular, when we looked at height measurement, the intermediate, the smaller plug containerized seedling wasn't always outperforming the bare root stock. But overall, when we compare height and diameter, and if I put in other measurements like relative growth, or if I run this as a regression, it actually teases it out a little bit, and it did outperform the bare root stuff. But again, residual basal area and stock type affected those things. Okay. So what does this mean? When we look at residual overstory basal area, it definitely had a significant effect on survival. In the bare root and the containerized seedlings, a lot of that effect came from their extremely poor survival in 0 square foot plots. And we attribute that to two different things. One, that clear-cut plot's just a harsh area. Keep in mind, this is one of the higher points in the county. It was exposed, it was getting full sunlight, doesn't get a lot of rain to begin with. It was rocky, dry, poor site. And it's just confounded by the fact that it's receiving all the elements. So I know that shortleaf pine is a sun-loving species, but there's a such thing as having a site that's just maybe a little bit too harsh. So that was tough on those bare root seedlings. That's at least how we speculated. The other thing that came up, and we didn't quantify this, unfortunately, but it's something that we noticed through visiting the site. This picture doesn't do it great justice, but this is the drip line of a white oak tree. We don't have much herbaceous competition underneath that drip line, but as soon as you get out of that drip line, there's a wall of stuff, wall of herbaceous competition. So that little added residual overstory basal area knocked back herbaceous competition quite a bit, and that could have played a role in influencing the survival of those seedlings on this site. When we look at stock type, the containerized stock clearly had better survival, and we attribute that to a couple of different things. One of the things is there's definitely a more intact root system in that containerized seedling, or more likely to have a more intact root system. Whereas the bare root seedlings, they can experience some of the damage during the lifting process. And then the other thing is when we looked at the two different containerized stock types, we found differences in those. And what we can take away from that is, or what we're attributing that to is the larger plug had a little bit more area for root development at the time of planting. So during that first year on this harsh site, it benefited from just that extra little bit of depth, extra little bit of volume, and was able to become established and survive a little bit better in those harsh clear-cut plots. The other thing that we can't rule out from this or in the next slide is seed source. There's a couple of studies out there that suggest that there can be some interactions between seed source and stock type. Some sources perform a little bit better as containerized stock, where some perform a little bit better as bare root stock. Unfortunately, we can't test for that in this study. We're not designed to test for that in this study. So I can't rule it out. That could be the culprit, but we used a bunch of orchard mixes. Our thought is that it probably buffered some of that out, but again, I can't rule it out. And when we look at growth, height and ground line diameters were certainly better underneath the low to no residual basal area plots. And that confirms that inverse relationship between overstory density and seedling size after our 2-year mark. And the containerized stock, again, it outperformed. It generally had better heights and ground line diameters after the bare root stock in that 2-year time period. And we attribute that to that more intact root system and the differences between the two containerized stock type to a little more rooting area, maybe a little bit more depth on that plug, and on such a harsh Piedmont site, just that extra little bit of depth and rooting area could have really led to some of those changes or differences. And again, we can't rule out seed source. So the management implications, based on what we found from this, and keep in mind, this is focused on establishment. This is 2-year stuff. We need to keep the study going for a long time to really pull many meaningful things out of it. But what we're seeing is that underplanting, it seems to work okay for at least getting the shortleaf pines established, especially on these harsh Piedmont sites where the clear-cut plots can be quickly invaded with herbaceous competition and just overall harsh site conditions. What it looks like is that the suppression of the competing vegetation and that sheltering effect by just a little bit of residual overstory basal area improves survival without negatively affecting growth by much. So it affects a little bit, but it wasn't a significant amount, at least after 2 years. Now here's just a picture of how the site's been invaded. This was fresh after the harvest. You can see how clean it was, and now it's Now it's a thicket. And the management implications of this, of the stock type, is containerized stock, they clearly outperform the bare root stuff. So if you have containerized seedlings available, especially if you're trying to reforest on one of these harsh sites in the Piedmont, you might want to look at a containerized stock. The good news there is that both of the containerized sources that we used did pretty well in this study. So these were not hard seedlings to track down. They just involved calling the seedling providers the year before and asking for them, and they were happy to grow them for us. And if the site allows, if your soil's deep enough that you can use a slightly deeper plug, we saw some benefit from that. So I know that not all sites are like that. In some sites, that short plug may be all you can really fit in the ground. But if you can increase that container size and put it in the ground, you could see some benefit from that. And that is all I had.